Recording in progress.
Call this meeting of the HDC's Organizational Focus Committee to order. Myself and Val Oliver present as members of the committee. Our solar work group members present, Lucy Dillon, Andy Pacino, and from the public, Tim Crothers. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda now?
Sure.
Okay, so that's about it. Minutes.
Working on them.
Okay. New business, discuss and take action on matters pertaining to HDC best practice is initiative. I think actually, if I may just comment on this, let's switch these to old business. Because they're kind of a continuation of prior. Or let's just put it as, go with me a second. Let's just put it as business items.
Okay.
Because there's no sense in differentiating that. HDC best practices initiative. We don't need to recount everything we accomplished in the last couple of HDC meetings, but I think value and good was had.
I think
Okay.
it seems like everybody's sort of a little more focused on what they should be doing ahead of the meeting.
We're putting in order some of the issues that with applicants and getting people informed on proper procedures.
Yeah.
Two that we're going to be discussing, and I'd like you to think of any you'd like to, will be how we as a commission address misrepresentations of facts, not opinions, but facts. And without getting into particular instances, I just want to bracket that discussion as we can't determine what's intentional and unintentional. We can just determine if there's an
What's
objective.
relevant or not relevant.
Well, what's objective fact that was misrepresented? Like the house is going to be 5 feet FEMA and it's 7, or it's not visible and it's visible. So things like that.
Okay.
But currently, there's not even a process to adjudicate those types of things, and they have. When they happen in a material way, they have a substantial negative effect. So if you could think about that. The other one I wanted to mention is we'll have a couple, Esme, I emailed you this. I've got a couple of things to add to the best practices. And I think one of them we need to put on the agenda for next Tuesday for the commission to review and vote or ratify. I don't recall whether I mentioned it at the meeting, but I'll get into it at the meeting.
Okay.
One of them is the 6-foot. Well, I'll just mention now. One is the adding the 6-foot horizontal and verticals to the digital processing.
What? Oh, yeah.
Because we didn't actually include that in the vote, but we
Okay.
discussed it, and
Yeah.
I didn't include it in the text. And the other is to differentiate between applications that are held and a party has contacted the HDC, or there's an abutter either for or against present, versus applicant where an applicant just doesn't show up.
Yeah.
Because the whole intention of that rule was to keep people who, applicants, agents who are putting on expensive holds when abutters are present or their attorney is present, either there at the meeting physically or on Zoom, and there's costs and downtime associated with it, versus someone like Jimmy Lyden who doesn't show up to have a roof discussed.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference in my certainly my perspective, and certainly the intent of the vote we had. We're looking to accommodate planning schedules of abutters and their agents, and so that their points of view can be represented in front of the commission. So that's the thing I'm going to bring up, is that it's for, basically that rule is for people.
I know exactly. Yeah.
Applications that have abutters involved either on Zoom or at the meeting, or even if they wrote a letter, they might show up. So we
Right.
can't just decide, oh, just because they're not here, it's not applicable. It's if an abutter has expressed an interest prior, or is at the meeting or is on Zoom.
When do the letters to the abutters go out?
Pardon me?
When do the letters to the abutters go out?
When do letters?
Typically, well, there should be 14 days prior to the application to be heard,
Okay,
but typically when they are ready to be submitted here to the HDC.
so the abutters have time to get the mail.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah,
And
Alright.
now because of the backlog, they get more than enough time.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
I just,
yeah. So those are, where we are with the best practices and, if you want to, I know we have a list, but if there's anything else that you think in this kind of stage where we're trying to get the HTC on its feet from how it used to be to what it needs to be doing in this environment, I think it'll be important to advance those pretty soon. Because in a way, what's happening is we're changing the culture of the operation, and I think if we can do it with these in place, these are kind of a couple of other foundational elements. Okay, so we're gonna move off the organizational focus committee business, which is organizational focus committee business, to the work group. So work group, where we left this last time, where we had some great discussion. We closed out with some great discussion on developing an index for applicants and agents to score their applications. It's highly important. I think where we resolved it, or at least I had in my head, is it's a highly important tool, but it's lower on the priority level because we have other things that need to be done so we can actually develop the criteria that will be in the index. And then we will at some point reevaluate our rankings and their priorities. And we will add a timing component, because one timing component is we may need outside resources to help us do the index. Tim volunteered to create one, by the way, and we decided that we appreciate the offer, and we jokingly, I stated that we've got to be sure this algorithm is weighted to the Act Smart application. So that's kind of where we left off. The bigger element that we did actually dig our teeth into were the sustainable guidelines. And specifically in all of these things, what we're looking at, just as a reminder, is what we have on the paper currently, what additional items or matters seem relevant to us as a work group. So we can make notes about those to be incorporated into this outline, so that once we get through the list, we can actually take the next step, which is starting to rank and prioritize these, or rank them in terms of importance and priority, and also actually get into the meat and potatoes of each one. So we're going to pick up with, I don't think we got into, we were at 8. Right?
Yeah, ready.
Okay.
Did you
So-
notes make it over to the next page there? Val? Yeah, I think we finished off 7.
Okay, and one of the notes just we transferred from prior discussion on a different topic was that with these groups of private solar gardens and or cluster installations, that virtual net metering between neighboring homes was one element in this, what I consider these kind of solar gardens and clusters as a form of mitigation versus solar installed on every roof in a subdivision if they had a cluster. So that in of itself, this becomes a form of mitigation, because it's taken from the front of the homes to, as we've been discussing, at the rear of the homes. Conceivably, it could be anywhere. So maybe one of the topics we look at is where proximity relative to subdivision layout. Subdivision, that's other layouts. I'm just going to briefly read through it. So private solar gardens and cluster installations, both at new developments, residential and commercial, and reviewed with respect to groups of existing structures, residential and commercial. That's the kind of overview. We originally discussed this as small, medium, and large scale applications. So there's a couple of lists of a few categories, and size may play a role in other topics we want to discuss. A short list of the related matters that we're going to want to discuss are considerations, concerns, and strategies through an interview process, professional staff, local attorneys, National Grid, etc. So basically what that was is looking at zoning and property rights and related matters of licensing, easements. The virtual net meeting was National Grid's, some of their, what would involve their sorry, just to get through a couple things. Their involvement would be on the virtual net metering, and we could get additional information from them. What town permit requirements would be, the various that could be involved. We may have something like, I'm just trying to flesh this out for a discussion in a moment. It could be that, Concom is not going to be giving waivers within the 50-foot buffer, that there would be, perhaps health would allow for septics to be located in proximity of these in a way that they would not normally let structures be allowed because they're on superstructures. Septics are not typically excavated to be maintained. They're installed until they fail, and then remediation occurs, and so.
They have to be maintained every 5 years in the Hartford watershed.
Yeah, but you don't disassemble them to maintain them. Is what I'm getting at. Is the superstructure of the solar could be put in place in some instances, but again, I'm just trying to identify, like, we'll have comments like that when we get to actually discussing. So right now, we're just trying to identify the different groups of topics that are related. So health,
Zoning.
zoning, health. Can we think of any others? I mean, there really aren't. Concom, I guess we could discuss. There's no reason not to. It'll probably be brief, but maybe something will come of it.
Aesthetic,
Attorney?
aesthetic.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna get to that, and then that'll be further down. Just on the town permitting and entities who might have input that we would benefit from considering, like attorneys will know, like staff professionals who know zoning inside and out. Attorneys who handle licensing and easements, things along those lines.
Maintenance, what about DPW potentially?
Maybe, yeah, maintenance,
Destruction of habitat,
So
that's right.
Lisa, okay, yeah. And who else around, would it be maybe land council or,
You're speaking to her.
well, I know that. But
Do you know anyone?
locally, would land council weigh in on trying to give input on this type of a solar solution? Or is it too small of a topic because it's decentralized? It's, this could be 50 by 100 square feet. It could be like
We keep an eye on
2,000.
everything.
Okay, good to know.
We've had to go to the land council before.
Okay, so land council, and certainly, that'll come up in the next 1.9, which is public solar gardens and clusters. Okay, so, I mean, that sounds like it's a decent, fill in that. Electric company requirements, we've kind of touched on central meter, distributed metering via virtual net meeting, transfer station, etc. And how it works regards account/owners, maintenance and repair agreements, etc. So that kind of ties in with your comment on maintenance. Any thoughts on that particular aspect of it?
Well, what would be nice is if in the beginning, before people do a development, all of this stuff is thought about and maybe put in place as part of that, like a homeowners association.
Well, it should be treated the
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
AC units and everything
Yeah.
else are supposedly considered on the.
You know, like some of them have cluster now septics.
Mhm. So what I'm writing is advancing recommendations beyond HCC purview. For. Design. Buy-in.
Well, I think if someone is coming in with a new building project or something, and their plan is to have solar, that should be considered at the same time as the location of the house and construction of it, because you don't want the person coming back. Well, don't have any other room, so we have, go into the 50-foot setback.
Sure, and that's makes perfect sense to me, Lucy, but we're talking about like groups of homes, and the HDC typically doesn't review subdivisions en masse. We tend to get them as individual owner. The Richmond development is an exception, certainly to the rule, correct me if I'm
Of
wrong.
everything.
Yeah, but I mean, with respect to HDC review, that's probably the only community, like, let's use Maple Lane off Rugged Road, or Gray
Hey,
Lane.
lady.
They all come in individually.
Those are good ones, but so let's not
Yeah.
cut it off before we can consider it. Maybe there's a part of that application where it should be required to actually be run through.
Well, what I was,
Planning phase.
yeah, what I was suggesting, in advancing recommendations beyond HDC purview, which is individual homes, for design buy-in prior to HDC application, prior to extent feasible subdivision layout, which is planning board.
To encourage it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Just tweak the angle of their house or whatever.
Sure, or accommodate it in a cul-de-sac or in some capacity so that they're guaranteeing that it can be put in, not to require it, but
Yeah.
it's already been considered. I think that's a great idea.
Okay, so just, I'm just trying to hit, I want to make sure, because that's gonna then, there'll be a blossoming of the avenues that need to be addressed in relation to that. That involve different parties. That's the stuff we'll talk about when we take the next step. Building permit requirements, I think would fall to some extent in that, but they're gonna have their own discussion elements, visual mitigation by virtue of placement, camouflage strategies, etc. So that would relate back to the layout. But is there any elements that we would want to think, we might want to talk about later on about visual mitigation, other than visual mitigation? The tool, the outcome is visual mitigation. The tool is by virtue of placement or camouflage strategies. Camouflage strategies being such things as trees, homes, like you just said, angled homes. It may not be necessarily in subdivision. Hey, Mary. It may not be that you're angling the home only for better solar if it is on a home, but also to, excuse me, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
That's why Mary will be here.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Right on time, Mary. The alarm just went off.
Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the visual stuff. On Dave said before you hear that, well, we'll just put up a hedge. Privet, I'm sorry, it's an invasive species,
Okay.
and it's not evergreen.
So we'll add, well, so that we're gonna pick up under visual noise mitigation strategies, number 10. So we can touch on that as a concept to extrapolate on, and you can touch my heartstrings on that one. The Landy Cypress are also alleyway creators, the way they're continuing on Nantucket and dive into the shade, so.
Can we add to this fences and community space, pergolas?
Mhm.
With any subdivision gonna necessarily include community space?
Yeah.
Potentially, so
Yeah.
with that as consideration, let's add that to the list. That's the time to accommodate it.
I think so.
Yeah, I heard one, I lost it too. Okay, so I got that, fences, community space. We did talk about, the concept of whether there are federal and state grants, loans, et cetera. So that would be something that the HDC is not necessarily getting involved in, but we would want to have an outside resource identified for us because, you know, if we're trying to, insofar as this work group, if we're trying to come up with ways to integrate sustainable energy, we want to do it in a way that people will like. And part of that is loans and subsidies and so on and so forth. I'm not suggesting that the HDC will set up a window with a little desk and we'll be taking applications for these things. But we want to have a working knowledge toward discussion in our recommendations. And perhaps then that also goes to advancing recommendations beyond the HDC purview, for instance, to the energy office. You know, so we're funneling these towards them. Maybe the energy office would this is, for example, maybe Remain Nantucket would like to come up with a dollar per match with national grid, so that the cable, to save costs on the cable that they won't recoup. And Remain would be the facilitator to have the community donate and other people dollar for dollar. And there's a fund. Now, was the HCC going to get in that? No, but we can spark discussions towards mitigation, because the idea is these clusters are going to be less obtrusive than having them on the front of a house with the most defining characteristic of many homes being the roof, which is what we always see on a home, unless there's street trees. So just bringing up, you know, why we might want to get the energy office involved too, with an example. It may simply be that because the energy office can quickly and easily identify subsidies and loans that the HDC is directing people to in their recommendations.
Yeah, the energy office should do it. The
Yeah.
HDC doesn't give a hoot about how much money is spent
Yeah.
or not spent.
No, we just care about the mitigation. And if you don't put it on your roof, it's been mitigated. So anything that can incentivize that is good. Visual noise will pick up down at number 10. Concept of a pilot approach. Each of four are going to create a roadmap for implementations in relation. Concept of this item, as with various other, is so that HE may sensibly forecast policy. So basically what this is, that we would do a proof of concept. We would maybe do an example or two very different examples. And not necessarily the work group, but we would get a resource that could game this out for us. And then we as a work group could look at where there's holes, because what we're looking to do is provide a coherent recommendation to the HDC, and we don't want to be making a recommendation on private solar gardens and cluster installations without having at least given some reasonable thought to case studies or potential. I wouldn't say case studies because they're not, you know, they haven't been done.
Well, Mary probably knows what a lot of other communities are doing.
Mary, do you know what other communities are doing with private solar gardens and cluster
Not
installations?
solar gardens, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then we'll be able to pull on that too. Yeah. That'll be perfect, because we're gonna get to 8 when we get, you know, when we get into discussion. So, do you have any thoughts on like pilots? Is there something you would think, I'll start with you, that would most benefit the HDC? Is it, you know, the standard subdivision approach? That would be a good case study, and then maybe like a mini development like fairgrounds, or is it something else, do you think?
I'm not really sure.
Okay. Okay, well,
Are
it's
you
just,
thinking something that's like been built and we use that as an example of how that could have had
Yes.
this?
yeah,
Okay,
and so it would be like a concept.
yeah, like Fisher's Landing, is the one that keeps coming to my mind,
Oh, yeah, that's not a bad
the
idea.
cluster development.
So Fishers. So we could use like Fishers, Naushaw, Nashua. And we just take a look at.
Would you use Gray Lady in this example?
Yeah, I mean, because they're a small scale one, and then where they might be interesting is because I think there's land bank property next to them. If not land bank, it's They're on the backside of Mizzen Mast, so there could be like this subdivision development of a cluster, like it doesn't have to be limited to in the middle
Right,
of one. It could
Right.
be, so that might be one that borders another one.
Right, because that blends into 9, right? Now we're talking about public space.
Yeah,
well, yeah, and like. Nasha has some community buildings.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that's another place you could put it, or, it's off of Fairgrounds, off of Sacanal. It's a 40B. Some market rate, some covenant.
Beach Plum?
Beach Plum,
Yeah.
that's another one, yeah, like they have a post office building and then a rec building, those sort of things that could be.
So I'm putting in a sub-case
Yeah.
study as common areas and structures. And, we might look at a commercial. It's in our list, but look at the commercial, development aspect.
Mm.
Here, look. I probably won't be the first to think it, but I'll be the first to say it, and that I heard it is. What if we partnered with Stop and Shop? I mean, they've got, they don't have an acre, but they've got a roof that's fully enclosed due to hip roofs. The other one is the hospital.
Yeah,
So what if there were some type of a solar installation there? I mean, the clusters don't necessarily have to be in a commercial setting on the grounds. The benefit of that is it also, here's a great example with the school, we've got the 4 mountains over here.
Yeah.
If those roofs had all been, hips on the wrap and they were only 8 feet tall. Above the floor, an area for the, mechanicals, we'd have, thousands of square feet. I'm not picking on people who were involved in design. I'm just saying, these are ideas of areas that it might work.
Collaborations and partnerships,
Yeah.
so that the clusters may look to other groups or commercial places of business that could accommodate
Yeah,
an install.
Yeah. And-
as a shared install.
yeah, and I think a lot of this, these are discussion elements along the lines of mitigation. Again, the idea is for the HDC, if it's not visual, if it's not visible, it's helpful to mitigate it. Actually, the footwork in these things are gonna be I think what we're looking to do is we're kind of a concept incubator in this because it involves the HDC with respect to mitigation, but we're not gonna be the group that's pushing these out. But under the umbrella of shared responsibility, maybe the town will put together a work group that involves a lot of different constituencies and stakeholders. And then they take these ideas and they develop their own and they start to implement them. Because then the preservation side with respect to the historic integrity of the structures benefits. But this work group isn't gonna be capable of doing any,
No.
it's just not, it's not our purview. Mitigation is.
you actually just said something interesting though, like with the hospital, they're putting up housing right now. Is that even a possibility, like they could put some on the hospital itself? And that net metering could be applied to those,
Everything's possible.
Yeah.
Right now.
Well, that's in that particular case, maybe not, because it has to be tied in. You can only virtually net meter your excess, and the hospital will suck everything down. Right?
Right.
Right, but that might even be that might be something we're looking at, in terms of the shared responsibility of mitigation, and it's not necessarily our work group, but the hospital putting solar on its roof.
What if everyone in this room had a house that wasn't eligible to have solar because of its orientation or front facing or for whatever reason? Could we partner with the hospital or with Stop and Shop?
Well,
And
So I think the hospital's got an interesting use case with all this parking. So they've got a lot of real estate there that could put up a lot of power with carpools.
but they don't want to pay the money, but we would.
right, so as opposed to getting down the rabbit hole, I'm gonna put in the concept of community funded private. Community funded, private and public. Multi-scale partnerships.
Yeah, there's a lot you can do there.
Yeah, boys and girls.
Right?
Another one, that,
So I
you know,
hospital group. And I'm not saying the hospital group is just open to be developed by, people who want to put solar there. I'm just saying as a matter of how that was designed, it is a large expanse of flat area. And that's worth looking at for future and using them as an example retrospectively.
Seeing on the inside, you can't see that from there.
Yeah,
Sure.
no, you can. There was a doorway open once and I went up there and got some good pictures. I'll deny that if they ever come after me.
Maybe,
I know, I'm teasing. They had an open house and someone took me up there. It was pretty cool.
I mean, if we consider a collaborative, right, where businesses could sign up to be a participant. And there could be 30 businesses or 30 businesses plus homeowners. They don't want to pay the upfront cost to have solar, but if there were some financial accommodation paid to them, they would be willing to install it. And so maybe that's a way that it can be mitigated and also encourage residential homeowners to have a solar stake
Mhm.
and to build out necessarily the island.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting.
Richmond would be a good spot too.
So I
All
think,
of Richmond.
I think we've got a good handle on those and we're gonna, these, I mean, clearly, I shouldn't have to say it, but I will. Just because we don't put it in the list that gets put together that we, informally vote on, doesn't mean it can't be added later. It's just, we're trying to give structure to our in-depth discussion at this point. We're just trying to build out that outline. So public solar gardens is gonna be similar. I'll just quickly read it. Unique category of installation addressing public and quasi-public entity land use, land bank, land council, land use for small, medium, and large scale applications. And we need to discuss and cover all related manners, many but not all of which are identified in the prior discussion. This item includes use of any such open space along border areas or otherwise. I think the focus is border areas. So is to, and I'll just say it before we get into discussion, is along border areas because, the entities that are involved have their own missions. And I think we all recognize that, but we want to be clear in broadcasting, even at this level of discussion, that, the HDC is in the work group is not suggesting that the land bank puts solar on all its property, so it doesn't have to go on homes. And that becomes part of their mission. We're talking about, given the vast amount of lands and the vast amount of buffer, a de minimis utilization of the border. In relation to the overall size of properties. And we're just talking about it as a concept to see if it's viable. And again, because if it isn't on a roof facing the primary street, but the community can benefit from solar, everybody wins on every side of the equation. So I'm going to suggest focuses along borders to clarify our intent a little bit more. I'm welcome, I'm open to push back on that either now or later, but pushback now I would just say is in the terms of what other elements would we want to talk about under public solar gardens and or public cluster installations. Or did we cover it mostly in the prior one?
I think there's one to add that will, umbrella 8 and 9, specific to 9B from the pilot approach, not necessarily, but potentially. Going back to the idea of identifying what contemporary code built home, stretch code built home requires per square foot per kilowatt. Kilowatt per square foot. Whether or not we can aggregate what that number is, or if there's state studies that have been done in relation to stretch code. So we have a baseline goal for a community cluster, for example, 15 houses on Gray Lady. we would already know if they're built to code would require X kilowatts. Does the shared array? Certainly, we wouldn't want to overbuild it. I mean, well, maybe not certainly. Do we overbuild it? Are there levels, are there tiered approaches where, okay, we're gonna suggest or ask that you hit 50% of the total capacity of the development? Is it 75? If it's 75, what's the value added to the project, to the town? Maybe some kind of a tiered structure, based on what that cost per square foot or kilowatt per square foot potentially is. I think that might be a reasonable way to approach what's reasonable. for a
Right.
house.
And there, so can I restate that to see if I understand it?
Sure.
So we're discussing the concept of the case study that pulls on a typical Nantucket home, the typical Nantucket home being based upon a multitude of variables that a HERS rater can put together and a solar installer, whomever the parties are, typically in conjunction with one another, to get a measuring stick of what is quote unquote a typical Nantucket home when it is a primary dwelling, perhaps a category of large, small, and larger or medium, a secondary dwelling and a tertiary dwelling, so that these can then be plugged into the case studies of, okay, we are looking at Richmond, but in this instance, Richmond is bordered by land bank that has no walking paths that surround it. So what we would be able to do then is extrapolate out from the typical homes item. That's a whole different item we have in here. Don't remember, we already discussed it. We would be able to suggest that this is information that's available to you and you as in the planning process as a designer of a subdivision. And you as land bank, if you were interested in partnering with them, and I'm not suggesting the land bank just gives this up. There may be, there should be a quid pro quo, and we'll discuss that I think I just want to tangent is the quid pro quo to the public agency. Such that they would be able to they would meaningfully be able to ascertain, or they would understand that there's a tool to ascertain really what's being done and how much of an effect it's going to have. And therefore, I would think policymakers in their vote would be able to say, oh, this makes sense to us. We're making a difference and it's demonstrable based upon these hard data. Is that kind of where you're headed?
Yeah, I mean, Richmond's a great example, right? With all that borderland.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily have to invest in solar, but they could take queries from the public that would say, well, we want solar. We don't want to put it on a roof for whatever reason. We'll pay Richmond for the space. That's a way for Richmond to monetize, for lack of a better example, for them to monetize, or for the land council to monetize.
Mhm.
But we don't do it that way, we don't want that one.
Okay. You can give it to me.
No, we're not interested in owning land.
Land council is in policies and
Watchdog.
watchdog. So
Okay,
Conservation.
Conservation Foundation then.
But what about,
They,
you know,
they won't let anybody do anything on their property.
okay, well,
Land is put into conservation at the state level, very hard. It's different
Yeah.
Changes to it, but.
Yeah.
It is interesting to think about as these other groups are acquiring land, and it's going to be part of, if they keep the structure there.
charter for the land.
And could there be an easement? So that at that 50-foot border or less, maybe there is an accommodation. I don't know, we're just spitballing.
And then the reason I threw in the quick pro quo to the public entity is because it may be that it involves. Just give me 1 second, or other is the third party. So it may be that it involves not only the developer and the public entity, like the land bank or something like that, but it may involve a third party, either the town or someone else, where they work with the developer and the land bank in order to get something the land bank would like, or would like. Maybe there's a piece of property, maybe there's something else, maybe there's something on the property that's being developed that they would like to have set up. I'm not going to suggest the land bank wants to go in and become the common area manager for subdivisions, don't get me wrong. But there may just be, it's just the idea that it's part of the discussion is whether a third party gets involved either as a facilitator or an intermediary with respect to adding, sweetening the pot. Because look, let's face it, if we're talking about shared responsibility, we're talking about the town of Nantucket, historic landmark, it's not just residential homes that are gonna solve this problem. And
Well,
the
we
town
have-
needs to be involved in a player role.
100%.
We have an overlay district, and for some reason, that's not viable at the dump, at the brown zone,
Well, that could
where,
be,
where it was supposed to be, and I can't remember the reason why it couldn't be.
so I just identify that as a. Get to the tail end of this. And these numbers are not indicative of anything at this point. Use of existing land resources / overlay district.
I'd rather see it on pieces that are already developed with buildings and industry rather than out in tablet land.
Yeah, and the idea, I mean, just to be clear, the idea of this is not that this is like a large installation like at Bartlett's that's on land bank property. I keep saying land bank because they're, you know, the obvious entity. They may say absolutely not, don't even talk about it, but it, you know, as a policy matter, I understand, but I think we're talking about mitigations that could perhaps come into play if we knew more, and we don't know what we don't know yet. So part of this exercise is determining what we don't know yet.
It's a think tank process.
Yeah. Okay.
I processed my 7th net zero PERS rating today. It was a 9-panel, 3.7 kilowatt installation on 640 square feet. Pretty interesting. I'm just throwing it out there for public record that net zero buildings are being built every day right now on the island with modest solar arrays.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
I mean, it's not, no, and I was on a, I forget what the committee was, it was that environmental construction years ago, but there really is never any mention about the size of these, some of these homes and structures.
Mhm.
It's, you
Great.
see the interior plans. It's like, you don't need a bathroom size of this room.
Well, and that's one of the topics in, oh. Oh, we do have 8. I knew we had 4. Number 16. One of the topics somewhere in here is, under the paired items, I think. Is this concept of what's the electric surcharge or the electrical use surcharge for structures that are being built. Again, shared responsibility. If the community is a historic landmark is to bear having solar panels on the front of the home, what's the trade-off? Are you putting in 10-foot ceilings and on 2 stories and maximizing your square footage on your ground cover at 2 stories with a full basement build out, and therefore you need, you know, X amount of panels, whereas if you came in with a more conservative 8.5 foot set of ceilings, you know, just to get a metric on that, what is the surcharge for design elements? Interestingly enough, I was at home not very long ago, and people loved the home, but they were just not thrilled with the fact that it was cavernous.
Yeah, horrible.
And they were like, you know, if we really understood this, we would like a more cozy feeling. So, you know, it could be that, and again, that's under mitigation. It's not something we're looking to dictate to people. Your home can only be, you know, each level can only be so much. But to have I think an honest, intellectually honest discussion, we need to have identified some metrics And when people come in, like we had very recently come in and say, oh, well, I need this, the HCC needs to understand what that means. Anyways.
Is that like by a cubic measure? Isn't there
Yeah.
something?
Yeah, so the HERS rating will take into account various factors, including the exterior wall space, the heating area, the type of heating system, all those factors. How many windows, you have tall walls, you have bigger windows, you have more energy use. So
How we ever know, but.
there's a whole, well, drill baby drill. That's what it was.
Seventh one
So-
here, net zero.
Guys, last one on this is, I think what we're gonna do is, unless you wanna keep talking about this one, which I'm happy to. Is I think, we're gonna combine these into one, so it'll be, instead of 8 and 9, it'll be solar gardens and cluster installations. It'll be A, private, and then the existing A and B for 8 will become a 1 and a 2. And then the B component of solar gardens and cluster installations will be public. And then again, we'll make these. So that way, when we sit down, and have a discussion over a meeting or two or various. I think the results and the direction, I should say the direction, the results of these discussions are going to be very similar. In a gross sense. But they're going to be very tightly related, so it seems to make sense to me to combine them. Does anyone have a concern with that? Any other comments on those? Again, no, it's not a speed now or forever hold your peace. Visual noise. Finally, we got 4:30. So I think what we're gonna do is, let's do visual noise. You guys want to do visual noise what time do we want to wrap up?
Tim's gotta leave at 4:45. No, not that we all have to stop then, but I'd like to be done by 5.
Yeah,
Okay, so why don't we plan on wrapping discussion up a few minutes before 5? So, thank you. Visual noise. I think Mary suggested that she'd like to get involved in this one as kind of subcommittee volunteer if we parse this out. Was that correct? The concept here, I mean, I know you can all read, but people at home can, if anyone watches. Wait, you said we had 38 viewers, was it?
Yeah.
Break out the popcorn, folks. Break out the popcorn. This one's gonna get interesting, I can tell. This is a big concern for the HDC.
yeah,
Is this sense of visual disharmony. I refer to it as noise because it can, to some people, translate as that type of a sensation. Visual disharmony of architectural elements within historic context amongst character and setting. So visual disharmony of architectural elements within the historic context, period, of a particular structure or a property. And then overall, plus number 2, amongst character and setting. So for instance, the streetscape or the neighborhood. So that is a really, I think that's, that's a very important aspect of what we do. Each with regard to shapes, disjointed and or disproportionate installations, focalizing, color contrast. On those, just to put out there, what we're talking about is rectilinear shapes on a roof that has, we've talked about this before, has a hipped dormer or a gable that ties in from the main mass to another axis of the main mass. So you have a valley, and then you have a rectilinear pattern, and it gets like these. There's a discontinuity in the pattern. It's not just a straight rectilinear form on a rectilinear roof. And I think we all understand at this point that part of our evolution was to, whether we consciously know it or not, is to pick up these types of things, either consciously or subconsciously. And it is not in keeping with character and setting, the historical context. It's just not. There's no. So I'm just identifying visual noise, and then you extrapolate that out into character and setting. Sure, the 1,000 words. Oh, color contrast would be focalizing color contrast would be a black panel on a silver cedar roof, And it's in a visible location. So that's a focalizing color contrast because you see it, so you look at it. Just to define the words, disjointed or disproportionate installations. I think that what that was more on the disproportionate. It's just that for some reason on some structures, solar panels can look to really overwhelm the structure. So it's one of the things we want to identify, and we're not identifying it necessarily just to say, we're trying to identify good, bad, and ugly, if you will. But also, what are the solutions?
Mhm.
And are they design oriented? Are they, you know, and we've talked about some of these, but that is the context. One of the things we talked about were pictures worth 1,000 words, what's inappropriate, and insert images. In the layout of our recommendations, we talked about how those would look, without getting into those now, because that'll be a separate item of discussion. And what I'd like to talk to you guys, or get you guys to talk about is, at this point, not what works, but what may work as visual mitigation. And when and where it's acceptable. Like, what are the situations, what are the types of visual mitigation we would like to explore? And when and where they may be applicable, without, you know, getting too deeply into the topic. I know it's kind of hard, but for instance, Leyland cypress in front of a house on Main Street to block a solar installation in the front yard is not a good idea. So, yeah.
One of the things too is how proud they sit off the roof.
Okay. And thickness of the
Yeah,
units
but I
themselves.
mean, you could have, someone could come in, and you guys are the ones in the business, could say, oh, our solar panels are 3 inches thick, but the mounting mechanism is, yeah,
Yeah,
Mhm.
it should be how far they are from the roof to final height.
Okay.
yeah, the question of proportion is a good one. As it relates to the overall size of the roof, right? Like a small cape that's got some prominent brackets that are holding the array off, even though it's set to fit and on a black roof, wouldn't be appropriate.
Yeah.
For example.
And where? So on the dead end road that is, you know, bordered by land bank property on the dead end. That's different than a dead end road that has a paper road that isn't being sold to someone in the yard sale. Or at least isn't currently contemplated, and, you know, with rate of development, who knows what's gonna happen? Or probably a better example would be a road that dead ends, but right next to it, you know, a yard space away is a road that at some point the town could take and open that up for connectivity, flow, and you know, planning patterns. So those are the types of things I'm thinking, not just specifically downtown and out of town, or in the Mid-Island commercial area by the airport versus the Mid-Island commercial area by Pleasant Street. We're not gonna get into redefining Mid-Island into smaller chunks because it makes absolutely no sense the way it is, but I'll just mention it.
Yeah, I think again, zoning and planning are critical
Mhm.
participants in this one.
So one will be what elements may pertain to zoning and planning. And then that'll open up a whole avenue of discussion when we get into the topic. What elements may pertain to building code? So the plumbing code, one of the things we talked about was, I don't know if you were here, let's see, is the idea that the ventilation stack plank, like that the, you know, the plumbing system smack dab in the middle of a southern facing roof is, you know, hugely not beneficial, because if it's in a location that could be approved, it creates this visual noise because they have to build around it, and they have to build around it the width of a panel, at least, if not the length, and then you have this jagged looking thing. Where on that particular home, if that vent pipe wasn't there, the stack pipe wasn't there, a full, you know, near edge to edge installation could conceivably be approvable.
Yeah, as I understand it, that all those, bent pipes and stuff, they can all be relocated. I mean, it doesn't have to be like the electrician who puts the thermostat right smack in the middle of the wall. If you look at my house on the corner of Liberty and Gardner, when you come down the hill, you don't see any stuff at all.
It's on the nice.
It's all in the back. There are no wires, there are no meters, there's no vent stuff you can see.
And so what that brings up, Tim, go ahead and,
So it's a true, it's a fair and true statement. Anything can be moved.
That's right.
Some things though are extremely expensive to move. And, so from just the cost benefit, they fall into that unmovable designation. So,
But if you're doing new construction.
oh, new construction, no.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
no issue with new construction.
And, you know, there are guys who say, oh, the meter's gotta be there. No.
No, I
that's
agree with that.
wrong.
Yeah, we agree with that.
Yeah.
But existing construction, I mean, I think we've got some stuff coming into the HDC where we're now going to identify if there's a vent pipe, it can't be moved, we can say non-movable pipe or movable pipe. In
You see-
fact, it's-
Well, the
you
homeowners
see how much
will-
this work group is already changing things? We've got the solar installer involved, that new install. I'm gonna jump in there to redirect us back to the topics. So one of them is solution strategies as applied to new versus existing, obvious, but just to put it on paper. And then we'll get into the discussion of costs and so on and so forth. But yes, new construction, much easier to address this, certainly more new versus existing. And of course, design timeline. This will relate to outreach and as relates to outreach efforts, because we're gonna have our recommendations, but we also want to be reaching out to people, designers, owners, educationally, informationally, so that, like Tim, who's already incorporating this, they can start to glom onto it. Concept decision information item is to put it all on the table, identify visual noise, identify where it may be deemed an issue, identify circumstances where workarounds can be implemented. So I think that's a pretty broad area for discussion when we get into it.
With landscaping, wasn't that what we were gonna put in visual noise?
Landscaping will be under mitigation, so that's number 11. I know you're chomping to get to that one.
That's right.
Thoughts on visual noise? I would like to call it something else. I'm not trying to be negative, but it seems the most appropriate.
No, I got one thought. So it feels to me like it would be beneficial if we took 3 or 4 example properties with a proposed array that was on the front of the house, the side of the house, and the rear of the house. And for example, the one that's on the front of the house, what are the examples of where this would potentially be approvable? And enumerate all of those, in your words, mitigations.
No,
As
that's
it's so when we walk out here, we can say, yes, it's on the front of the house and it would be approvable under these conditions.
You know, sometimes it's as simple as instead of a straight shot into the house. To take
Move
the
the driveway.
driveway and.
Yeah.
so I'm gonna push you guys on that to mitigations.
Okay.
Tim, I get your point. I think, there's 2 ways that we can do this. In the initial discussion, we went with a picture's worth 1,000 words. And, or we could do so basically we could utilize existings to accomplish what you just said, or we could use case studies. There's nothing that precludes us from doing both, other than existing images are gonna be easier to mark up and annotate since we don't have, illustrators on board and all the rest of it at this point. The other part of it is that that is actually something we contemplated is a part of our final product in our recommendations, is both this concept of what works and what doesn't, whether it's an imagery of existing or that's created, like for instance, with the existing sustainable guidelines. Does that jive with what?
Yeah.
Okay, so good, but we're on it.
I think it's gonna be both. It'll be
Yeah.
conceptuals
It's another
plus
way of
existing, and it
saying,
doesn't necessarily have to be on.
how do we test and validate what we've done together?
Yeah.
Right, I think that would be a useful exercise, so we can either start with some examples, or when we get to the end, we can say, okay, let's randomly pick a few homes, right? How would that work? How does it work against that home? How does it work against that home? How does it work against that
Or
home?
give it up on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Hey,
Yeah.
so you know what, pictures are worth, as you said, worth 1,000 words, so you guys must have pictures of.
Good point.
Yeah.
Resource, development of
Yeah.
resource. We want
Right,
pictures.
so
The good, the bad, the ugly. From the street.
Well, maybe to go back to our discussion from the last meeting, the rules-based calculator, we might use those examples to score them
Yeah,
for edification for the HDC members.
yeah,
This is how the score is impactful.
Yeah.
And if it's a 62, it's not gonna fly.
why?
Based, well, it's a made up number.
Oh,
It's gotta be 80 or above to be approvable by HDC, maybe,
yeah.
okay.
right? So based on that chart.
Oh,
Where
gotcha.
you're gonna check the
Okay.
boxes and X, Y, Z, and here's the final output.
Yeah,
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 that's a lousy score. It's not gonna fly. And Tim's suggestion might be the evidence that says this is why it doesn't work. Whereas if it's an 85 with an example in Tim's design phase.
I forgot about the numbering part.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
index is gonna be an inch, so we discussed that at the tail end of the last meeting, and that's gonna be a really interesting tool because to develop, because. Again, we didn't get into things, but you bring it up, makes me think of proportion. What are the elements that are good? It's not just, is it visual or not? But if it is visual, what are the proportions? What is the visual noise factor?
Right.
What is, all these different elements? So that's gonna be an interesting discussion when we get into it.
Yeah, what's your evergreen score?
Mary?
Sorry.
Well, that
pardon.
sounds like you're sort of, instead of being, invisible, sort of then how do you quantify minimally visible?
And it will be based on location.
Yeah, yeah.
So like, for instance, the dead end road, but if this one is on, it's got the potential for being connected versus it's a budding land bank. Then we might say, well, you gotta go to the index, you gotta go to the tool, the calculator.
Yeah.
Because if it's above a 62, just to keep using that number, or if it's below, well, we'll also have to decide whether it's a higher number is better or lower. But yeah, so
Be
minimally,
able to quantify something, because I know that that's something that's been interesting is the idea of minimally visible, but then what does it really mean? And
Right.
if you're able to quantify it, that's.
so I'm gonna put this in here as our discussion. One of our discussion items is minimally visible definition.
There's some good pictures on the solar map to kind of look at, what parts of town or what parts of the island are, I would say less significant, but are not, the old historic district.
So I put in just, Tim, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here.
You gotta go.
Right, Chuck, you got.
Tim, you gotta remember, I'm not picking on you, but I just saw your logo. Just because it's a public meeting, you should identify yourself as, you don't have to do it now, but you should identify who you work for and that you're,
You introduced me today.
I know, but before you speak, before you speak,
I was out, I'm like, oh, thank you.
I just don't wanna lose track of it. So, Mary, I got minimally visible definition, also versus.
Bye, Tim.
Versus. Minimally visible, and then it relates to visual, easily visible areas. Also, and or as relates to context, so I guess that's easily visible as context, so I'm just gonna cross that off. And as relates,
Did you think about visual intrusion as opposed to noise?
yeah, please think on that, because I feel like it's not right, but it just
And
kind of,
intrusion still has a bit of a negative connotation, but it is, I think, more factual than,
yeah.
although visual noise is a great,
I mean, for me, visual noise,
it's a great description.
it's like, because it disrupts, for me, noise disrupts what you're doing, and these visually disrupt the experience of the character in the setting of the architectural elements.
Yeah.
I'm open to change on those stuff, anything except for the name of the.
I just, you know, I wouldn't have picked it.
That's okay.
You
we
know,
could-
rise sings to me, that's ocean.
I gotcha. I had,
We're not encouraging rising.
I had to work with what I said at town meeting, which was resiliently integrating sustainable energy, so it went right to rise. In so many words. Okay, so we're gonna jump to mitigation. We got about 10 minutes.
Interference is the word.
Okay, I'll make a note to discuss what,
Workshop.
okay. Mitigation, visual impacts, nationally accepted concepts, avoiding, minimizing, rectification, reducing or eliminating over time, compensation, local versus typical. Compensation would be parenthetic local versus what typically happens on a regional and national model. Likely very different, perhaps not desirable or even practical. Oh, you know what that's about? This came up in an HDC meeting. I just want to give some understanding to that comment. The national standards are not sensitive to, they're sensitive to historic structures, typically not historic districts. If you look, and they're also not what you think. This came up with Stone Alley. The concept, and I think it was the National Museum of Science. The concept of what the national standards are very different than as are practiced locally. What I mean by that is, you know, the museum I'm referring to is this beautiful historical structure, very large, and then behind it is this very contemporary structure that the only bearing it has is that it's highly contemporary architecture. The roof material color is the same, the wall exterior cladding color is the same, and the fenestration coloring and the tint is the same. But it's a very different standard than I think we on Nantucket are accustomed to. So I wanted to point that out, and then in that context, I wanted to point out that their mitigation categories I think are very useful, but how they apply them are not necessarily how at least the HDC functions. And the HDC functions to some extent based on public pressure, I'll admit it, but largely based on the guidelines, and the guidelines, they're very inconsistent. We can get into that discussion later, but I just wanted to give you some context of why I mentioned that that they're different and perhaps not desirable or even practical. Oh, and the last mitigating consideration of mitigation is the permanence. So for instance, aluminum storm windows can come off, though they never do. Versus, well, it's probably not a good example. I'm not always great at examples, but I try. So that's the concepts of mitigation. Locally, type and extent, including what? Looks like various features and characteristics, including the review, signature, so basically this comparing contrast. I think B is where we get into plant materials, fencing, driveways, the curvature of a driveway in conjunction with fencing. So I would say site layout, including access, expressed visually. Example, curved driveway. What else do we look for in like when we mitigate? You know, we say a tree, we might want to, you know, what type of tree, plant material type, size.
I think site is a good category for this, because if you plan ahead of time for it and make it work for you, but also work for us, it's a win-win all the way around.
And maybe repositioning of buildings,
Right,
Oh, yeah.
structures.
move your
And
front
you
door,
mentioned orientation
move your front
earlier.
door.
She had, you,
Could you move your front door? We're willing to move our front door.
so one of the things, I'm not sure I'm taking this exactly as your meeting, but you know, sometimes we'll get an applicant to say, well, it can't be on the front of the building. Well, the guidelines, is it shouldn't be on the primary structure, on the primary roof mass, facing the primary road. Well, I'm gonna move my front door. You
To the
know,
side.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
that's
you can't do
brilliant.
that, but you're not supposed to.
Yeah. so I'm just gonna put move front door in parentheses here. So we've identified screening elements, plant materials, fencing, others we want to talk about. Type and size.
I think, I know we're always generally told that it's not a worthy application, but like,
That's not a screening element.
a secondary mass or an accessory mass to put something on,
Like a pergola.
and also a shed,
Mhm.
you know,
Right.
if nothing else, something like
A
that.
carport.
But all the sheds and garages are becoming secondary.
Yeah,
I
they're living
know.
space.
I think that's, I mean, that is the thing is that, you know, we have these outbuildings that were utilitarian, that would be perfect places to put these
Yeah,
arrays.
So one of the things we get, and it might be, I don't know that we can address it in mitigations, is, as recently as last night twice, is that it doesn't make sense monetarily for me to put that on, because I can't get a loan to cover the cost. If I only do a certain amount, I need to do more. For me, it's kind of difficult to understand. I'm not using recent examples, but the general concept is, if I want to help,
Yeah.
is it only I'm helping because I'm getting it paid off?
Mhm.
Like, I don't think that,
But no other part of the program would anyone say, well, I can't. Like, nobody else's financial equation comes into play.
Right.
In any other application.
no, it gets played as, played off as, energy efficiency, sea level rise, save money. Don't get me wrong, it's not that we're not sympathetic to those things,
But you
but,
almost don't need to know about.
well, we
Right.
You're
don't,
not gonna
Right.
hurt you.
well,
Right.
the problem, I mean, we're segueing it off, but since we're in there, the issue with it is, it's good for general knowledge. I'll always hit on these when I can, because we get our.
There's
crap
38
beat out
people
of us.
watching.
Mhm.
Is this concept that if we let someone discuss that, we also need someone, we need, if someone wants to discuss the lack of reclamation.
Yeah.
That, as reported by Bruce when he was here, LA, California is drowning in these things.
Mhm.
Is there an environmental risk? All of those things in order to be fair, but in every event that any of that stuff is discussed, an application, an approval or a denial is more easily subject to an appeal where they would win, because
Yeah.
we're discussing things that aren't relevant. Here, we get a chance to dig into those a little bit of things for context, but we can't get too far into it.
well, I think that the whole rating system that we're talking about coming up with is gonna mitigate some of that.
Mm.
Well, I can't do it, then it's not gonna make sense. Because there's gonna be a calculation that says, yes, it's you know what I mean?
Yeah, because one aspect is gonna be the size relative to what you need for your next
Right.
at home.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, the example that I used earlier, the 3.7 kilowatt array is only for 600 square feet. It's not gonna power their 6,000 square foot main house. So it's gonna live on the garage, right? So,
Mhm.
but is that economically feasible for them? In that example, they would want it on the big house too.
Right, and
That
they,
client may.
and there may be a component in the calculator for that information since we're doing it, but it's for them, not for HDC.
Sure.
It's something we should, and, it's very uncomfortable to have to call someone out on that. But it's the integrity of our process that we're not discussing those. We're getting really, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, just to that real quick, I have a note here that's a volume metric to square foot metric, they're not the same, right? Your 10-foot ceiling example is an important one, right? So what is the volume to square foot ratio? 12-foot basements and 10-foot ceilings, right? Make a different building and more modest depth. So
Yeah,
I'm gonna look at that too. So
so in our typical, that falls into our typical home item. And
Yes.
electrical search and a surcharge.
to clarify that.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. So what I'd like to ask you guys to do is just, I think this important, the concept of mitigation is important. We're gonna flesh that out more in future discussion. But let's take a look at that, please. Just, you don't have to, just the idea of what could be elements for mitigation. And if you, I think the most important takeaway from item number 11 is A minus the parenthetic phrases. It's easier to read. These were really for me to process, not for you all. But if you read through A and you consider avoiding, minimizing, yes, if I can talk, rectification, reducing or eliminating, compensation, and permanence, so we can wrap this topic up in terms of identifying elements at the next meeting to start. And then we'll jump into the next set. Fair enough? Okay, cool. Are there any general comments? I realize this, I realize this is really not fun. I get it. I'm just trying to get us through it. So that we can partay here.
Well, if we stay on task next meeting, we might get close to finishing.
Okay.
Yeah, so with regard to that, I can be at the next one, but then I'm leaving for a couple of weeks, so I won't be back
Oh.
until the 27th.
Thank you. That's actually what I wanted. Would you mind pulling up the calendar? So glad you mentioned that. We have 2 minutes left.
I'm late next week too.
I would like to see if next week we can meet on the 14th. And then, for sure, to get a chunk out of some of this. And then the question is, do we meet on the 21st and or the 28th?
I can't be here the 20th.
Right, got you.
Yeah.
Well, if you can't be here, we don't actually have a quorum.
I know, and I'm sorry,
Um,
but I never go away.
Really
Really
nice.
Arizona.
nice. So the 21st, we won't meet. What do we think about the 28th?
May I interject, that week we do not have HDC at all.
The 21st?
The week of the
26th.
26th through the 30th. Due to the holiday.
Okay.
Got that.
So do we want to, come in and I can set up the meeting to record or on the 28th, or do we want to meet on the 14th and then on the 4th?
That makes sense. I think we take the holiday off.
Yeah,
Okay. I mean, I'm fine with that. I just wanted to do what you guys wanted. to do.
yeah.
So we're gonna meet on the 14th and then we'll reconvene on the 4th.
Outlook on life.
Yeah, bouncing into the new year.
I think after that meeting on the 4th, we'll be close to closing out this discipline and getting ready to get into phase 2.
Nuts and bolts.
I think maybe that's our goal.
That's definitely our goal, because that's gonna take a little bit of work to prioritize relative importance and time and the other aspects. If you want to see where we're going, it's on the last sheet. Okay, again, in my words, for my head, the process, not necessarily easy reading. I didn't edit for that. That's the other reason why we're not just distributing this yet. It's, we want to get through the whole thing and make it a little bit easier for people to process.
I appreciate thinking through the nuts and bolts, even if it is irritating at times, because no, I find in the world at large, right, people wait. And then they go, oh, well, we'll learn from our mistake on that one. I don't want to learn from any mistakes. I want to think about it all the way through.
Well, thank you for supporting our initiative. Seriously, we know each other for so long. now.
I'm not a leaper, I'm a looker.
I'm a planner. I'm not organization.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you. I was waiting. You're in favor on it.
Aye.
Thank you, everybody.